Alright guys, this is lecture number 3, Planing English America, Southern Colonies. Now, just as an overview here, Southern Colonies in the colonial United States, a couple of tendencies here. One, they tended to be religious-wise, they were tolerant. Your life expectancy tended to be shorter because of the climate and harsh work conditions. And lastly, there was a large disparity of wealth. So you were either rich or you were poor. There wasn't like a huge middle class. Now, before we get to all that, though, let's look at how the first of these colonies got started. Okay, we already looked at how the Spanish sort of discovered the New World and began to colonize, say, the southwest United States and Mexico and parts of South America. Now let's look at the English. So Henry VIII. Henry VIII is famous for his 7 wives. He's going to marry a Spanish princess originally. And in actuality, he wasn't supposed to be the one to be king. It was supposed to be his older brother. But after they get married, his older brother and the Spanish princess get married. He dies. They think probably of meningitis or something like that. They're not exactly sure today. But so the Pope makes a special dispensation, letting Henry marry his former sister-in-law. So then when he wants to get divorced, the Pope is kind of upset about this. But him and his Spanish wife have a daughter named Mary. He then gets divorced against the Pope's wishes, embraces the Protestant Reformation, right, which you guys should already understand, basically the idea of the schism in the church between Catholicism and Protestantism, which is going to lead to a series of wars and the sort of at the heart of the conflict between the Spanish and the English. Now, also with that, Henry will eventually die, not having really a male. He'll have a male heir, but that male heir dies after a couple of years. And there's going to be a series of rulers you can see kind of over here. Basically, what you need to know is that Elizabeth, right, becomes the ruler at the end, okay? Mary is going to bring back Catholicism. She's going to react strongly to Protestantism. And eventually, Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn, and Henry's daughter will come and be the queen during this sort of English Renaissance, this golden age, what they refer to as the Elizabethan era. Now, Elizabeth is going to have her famous sea dogs here, right, who are going to be led by Sir Francis Drake. Sir Francis Drake is going to capture the Manila Galleon. See, the Spanish would load up their ships and say on the, I want to say it was at Veracruz on one side, and I don't remember what it was on the other side, somewhere and along the coast of Peru, I believe. But they would sail from the western side of South America to Manila in the Philippines. And the ship would be loaded down with gold or silver from the Potosi mine. And Sir Francis Drake is going to capture that, okay? He's going to sail back to England, not knowing if they had made peace with Spain or whatever, and if he was going to be hung, but they hadn't. So he shows up with the Manila Galleon and basically pays off all the debts of the Spanish, like the national debt, of England. And so he becomes Sir Francis Drake and becomes a big famous guy. And he's going to help heckle the Spanish Armada when we get to that in a second. But him and one of his other partners, Sir Walter Raleigh, are going to come up with the idea of the colony at Roanoke Island. Now, some of the famous stuff about the colony at Roanoke Island. It's going to found Virginia, named after the Virgin Queen Elizabeth. It's going to be sort of a half-hearted attempt. They're going to go settle the colony off the coast of Virginia. But then they're going to struggle to make it back to resupply the colony. And by the time they do resupply the colony, it will have sort of been absorbed by the wilderness. And the only thing that was left was a engraving or something scratched in a tree that said Croatan, okay? And nobody really knows what this means. Nobody knows what happens to the settlers. There's a lot of different sort of stuff left there. But we do know that they left, or they died. And that was the first sort of attempt at colonizing for the English. Now, eventually, 3 years later, also, yet again, the Spanish and the English still at war with one another. If you look at this picture here of Elizabeth, you can see in the background the Spanish Armada. And then them dying over here. What's going to happen is the Spanish are going to attempt to invade England. At this point, it was the high point for the Spanish Empire. Now, what's going to happen is Sir Francis Drake is going to lead the British Navy against the much larger Spanish Armada. The Spanish would have had slower ships but more heavily armed, while the English would have had smaller ships that were more maneuverable. There's a long story about this, but the Spanish will pick off the larger Spanish ships. The English will pick off the larger Spanish ships, and then eventually the Spanish will try to retreat, but what they're going to have to do is sail all the way around the island of Ireland. And in doing that, there's going to be a storm, and it's going to crash the majority of the ships against the rocks. Your textbook will refer to this as the Protestant wind. But if you look at a map, there's tons of shipwrecks of the Spanish because of their poor seamanship / weather that they sailed into. So the English, coming off this victory with the Spanish in the Elizabethan age, are going to be high on feeling good about being English. Okay. Also, it doesn't say it here, but there's this thing called the Enclosure Movement. Okay. And the Enclosure Movement was this idea of sort of like changing the way that the English looked at private property. You had the feudal system, right, where you had a large farm and you had all these people that worked on it and you kind of had to take care of them. Well, the Enclosure Movement, these guys decided to kick everybody off their land and fence it in and raise sheep. Right? It was a lot easier and cost-effective to have a guy with a shepherd or a herding dog, and you could raise sheep instead of having a big farm. So with the Enclosure Movement, they kicked a bunch of people off their land. Well, what did those people do? They moved into the cities, right? So you had these cities that were beginning to swell with extra population, so the surplus population, and the ideas of primogeniture. Primogeniture is this idea that the oldest son gets all of the family wealth. So the lands and titles and money. And so if you were the second son or a daughter, you didn't get anything. So if you were a second son and your family had been kicked off the land, you began to push into these cities. So this surplus population needed somewhere to go. And so oftentimes it began to immigrate to the New World. Now, what's going to happen is wealth is going to be used to fund a lot of these colonies. And so what happens is they're going to start what we refer to as joint stock companies. I believe I already mentioned this in an earlier lecture, but it was a good way for people to pool their money together to mitigate the risk of an investment. So the idea would be that instead of me footing, let's say, $1 million for something, I could foot a part of it. So if it failed, I wouldn't lose all of my money. At the same time, these joint stock companies were usually created to be dissolved eventually. So I'm going to throw in my part of the cash, we're going to make a profit, and then we're going to each take our profits out of it and move on. So it wasn't like a corporation that was going to live in perpetuity. So in 1604, there's going to be peace with Spain. That peace is going to be short-lived. About 20 years later, they'll be back at war again. And this peace is going to allow them, yet again, time to begin to establish colonies in North America. Namely, as we're going to see, this is going to start with Jamestown. All right, so Jamestown is going to be established by the Virginia Company, a charter created by a charter from James I. They're going to settle in the James River here in Virginia, as you can see on the map. What's going to happen is the guys that they're going to send over originally are there to do two things, really. To try to find a way through North America, right, to get to the Pacific. This is going to be a continuing theme. Also, to find gold or riches or whatever, okay? So the people are going to feel somewhat like they were abandoned, all right? But that's not really the case. And one of the things they did was in the charter for Jamestown, they ensured the colonists had the same rights and privileges as Englishmen, so that they would feel connected. This is important because down the road, this is going to be the main reason why we see the revolution. These guys aren't going to feel like they're being treated with the same rights and privileges of Englishmen. So the guys that show up are going to be ill-suited to this harsh lifestyle. They're going to be gentlemen adventurers is what it's called, or they're going to be guys that are good with gold. They're not going to be like farmers and people that are used to working in hard conditions. So a large number of them are going to die off. It's going to be John Smith, Captain John Smith, who had been a mercenary and had been sold into slavery and all these things on the other side of the world, is really going to whip them into shape. Now, he's not going to stay there forever. Okay, he's only going to stay for a period of time after getting them sort of organized. He is going to be captured by the Powhatan Indians and sort of put on trial in this big sort of theatrical thing to sort of show the power of the chief of the Powhatans. And Pocahontas is going to save him, all that sort of stuff. There's no relationship there, though, between John Smith and Pocahontas, even though that's the way society will make it look. Now, what's going to make the Virginia Company money and make Jamestown sort of stick is going to be John Rolfe and the introduction of tobacco. Okay? This is going to make them profitable. Tobacco, as we know, is a cash crop. It'll be grown with the extent to make money, not to feed people. All right? And John Rolfe will have smuggled it in, even though it was sort of outlawed for John Rolfe to have it, not by the English, but from the Spanish. Now, before that gets going, I kind of got out of order here. There's the starving time. So initially, as I said before, when they showed up, they picked a bad position for the city. Jamestown was kind of set back on the murky, malaria-filled banks of the James River, where it should have been sort of higher, maybe with high ground instead of sort of low, marshy area. Yet again, the people that couldn't do anything. And so what happens is they have that first winter, and they refer to it as the starving time. Something like 40 people die. One guy resorts to cannibalism. He murders and assaults his wife, and clearly they're going to have to execute him. And John Smith institutes the, if you don't work, you don't eat sort of mentality. Now, after Smith leaves, a guy by the name of Lord Delaware is going to show up, and he's going to be a veteran of the wars in Ireland. And basically, he's going to be tasked with defeating the Native Americans. So you're going to have the first Anglo-Powhatan War, where he's going to institute these very brutal tactics, and that's going to be ended with the marriage of Rolfe and Pocahontas. Now, Pocahontas is going to be taken back to England, where she's sort of shown off and all this sort of stuff, but she'll die of some unknown disease like a year and a half after getting there. Rolfe will then return to Virginia, and he will die in the Second Anglo-Powhatan War. Now, the Second Anglo-Powhatan War is also going to be brutal, but it will then start the sort of tradition, as we'll see, of forcing the Native Americans from their land, okay, and putting them somewhere else, kind of eventually what we see with the ideas of reservations and stuff like that. In 1619, we're going to see the introduction of slavery to work the tobacco fields in Jamestown, and also we're going to see the creation of the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses is going to be representative government, right? So people that are going to elect their own officials, and it will sort of start the sort of state legislature of Virginia, okay? Now, this is going to show, it's going to become basically growing tensions for James I over Virginia. One, he hated tobacco, and he outlawed smoking, or created a heavy tax for it in England. And then also, he didn't like the idea of self-government for the Virginians, or the Jamestownnians, I guess. And so he revokes the charter for the Virginia Company and creates a royal colony in 1624, which means they are directly ruled by the crown. Okay, so this should say 1634. Lord Baltimore is going to establish Maryland. Now, he's going to establish Maryland for financial reasons, hopefully to make tobacco money, right? Maryland's going to be the fourth colony created, but it'll be the second major plantation colony created. Now, besides sort of that tobacco money, he also wanted it to be a refuge for English Catholics, okay? Baltimore was Catholic, and also, remember, back home in England, there was a tension with Catholics in a mostly Protestant country. So, Maryland's going to become a popular place to move, so you could have a tobacco plantation, all that sort of stuff, and there's going to be large numbers of Protestants that begin to move in. So people were worried that, namely the Catholics were worried that they would begin to limit religious freedom. So we're going to pass the Maryland Act of Toleration. As it says right there, it was unusual for the time. It basically, if you believed in the divinity of Christ, you were okay. Now this meant that Jews and Muslims weren't really that big of a deal, but atheists and stuff like that at this point in time were not acceptable in Maryland. Okay, the West Indies. So England is going to really have the scraps here because the Spanish are going to claim Cuba and Hispaniola and all these things. And so the English hop in and get the next best thing, and they get Jamaica. Now, the West Indies provided an environment for the growth of sugar. Okay, the sugar economy in the West Indies was much like the tobacco in the southeast colonial, now United States. Sugar growth, sugar plantations, however you want to call it, were incredibly labor intensive. So this is also going to be the massive influx of African slaves. So these African slaves would come in. It ends up kind of being a staging area also for slaves into the southeast colonial United States. So the 1661 Barbados Slave Code, which kind of establishes the rule of, white masters over African slaves. Here, I'll read it to you here real quick. If any Negro or slave whatsoever shall offer any violence to any Christian by striking or the like, such Negro or slave shall be for his or her first offense be severely whipped by the constable. For a second offense of the nature he shall be severely whipped, his nose slit, and be burned in some part of his face with a hot iron. And being brutish slaves, they deserve not for the baseness of their condition to be tried by the legal trial of 12 men of their peers as the subjects of England are. And it is further enacted and ordained that if any Negro or other slave under punishment by his master unfortunately shall suffer in life or member, which seldom happens, no person whatever shall be liable to any fine therefor. Basically, it's saying that you don't have the rights and privileges of an Englishman, and that your master can treat you any way he likes, kind of idea. Now, if you've ever wondered why, say, the West Indies never joined the Revolution, well, the main thing is most of the aristocrats that lived on these islands had large slave populations, and they were always deathly afraid of a slave revolt. And since they were deathly afraid of a slave revolt, they relied heavily on the British Navy to help keep order in the West Indies. So when the United States or the colonies rebelled, the islands did not, because yet again they were in need of the British Navy. Now, what you're going to see here is Charles I is going to create the Carolinas, and the Carolinas are going to end up being sort of like a supply colony for the West Indies. And some of the people from the West Indies are going to move to the Carolinas and take their slaves with them. So you're yet again going to see this influx of African slaves into the sort of colonial 13 colonies. All right, on the previous slide I said Charles I. I meant Charles II. So you have the English Civil War. Charles I dissolves the Parliament. Cromwell becomes the leader, Puritan control of England, at the time of the Commonwealth, if you will. Eventually, they're going to have the Restoration, as referred to as, and Charles II is going to come back to power. Charles II is going to imbue the Carolinas to his wealthy buddies. Okay, it's going to be famous for growing rice, and it's going to have, yet again, as I said before, be basically a supply colony to the West Indies. So the Charleston, named after Charlestown, becomes the most sort of capable of these early Carolinian cities. Over time, Virginians are going to move into what becomes North Carolina, and you're going to see this separation. And it's interesting because, really, if you think about Charleston here as being a sort of big city, this kind of aristocratic area, right, South Carolina is basically going to be centered around it, while North Carolina is not going to have anything to do with it. They're basically going to be disgruntled Virginians who, as your textbooks referred to as squatters, people that had no rights to the land. they are going to move in and begin to grow rice. They begin to cut trees down. They become very big in the creation of stuff for the shipping industry. So pine tar becomes really important. Eventually, that pine tar is what leads us to the idea of the Tar Heel, which is where the University of North Carolina gets its nickname. So in 1712, being drastically different areas, they officially separate in 1712. And you have South Carolina, the more aristocratic, North Carolina, less aristocratic, both rather relatively democratic, though, and religiously tolerant. Next one we're going to look at is Georgia. I'll be pretty quick here. 1733 is going to be a buffer colony. The idea there that the region between Spanish Florida and the Carolinas, they needed something to ensure that the Spanish didn't encroach upon their territory. So in 1733, they charter the colony as a charity colony, or also referred to sometimes as a penal colony, because it's going to take prisoners and move them in, okay? And you can see the use of prisoners, and you can see kind of how the city-town set up, kind of military-esque in the picture right there. And the hope had been that they were going to cultivate the silkworm. Now that falls apart. And actually, all these rules, there was no drinking, there were no slaves, there was very strong laws against all of this sort of stuff. And eventually it falls apart. Kind of, Georgia started sort of like Australia to an extent. Now, once it all falls apart, it becomes just kind of another southern colony. But it's going to be the last. It's going to be the last colony. So it's going to be 1733. All the other 12 colonies will be founded at that point. We're doing this geographically. That's why we're talking about it now. But so it's going to be the last one to the game. And it's not going to be very profitable. All the stuff I said at the beginning, the disparity of wealth, the life expectancy, all that sort of stuff really falls hard on Georgia. So, real quick here, plantation colonies, England's southern mainland colonies shared a devotion to exporting agricultural products, either tobacco or rice or indigo or whatever. They had some cash crop that they were selling for money to then buy other stuff. Most of them relied on slavery, if not slavery, indentured servants at first. This also led to slow-growing cities, right? Because people lived out in the countryside on their farms. Most of them had religious tolerance, and they also had a tendency to expand, right? You wanted to start your farm, so you moved away and then got land and so forth and so on. Now, what that meant was you were going to run into Native Americans. Running into those Native Americans caused other problems. Also, as I said before, life expectancy low. It was hot. Disease was prevalent. Also, this work that was done there was relatively difficult. Also, if you were wealthy, there was a very few number of wealthy people, but they were very wealthy. They were what we refer to as the landed gentry. They owned land, they had political influence, and then the vast majority of people outside of the landed gentry in the South tended to be poor. So there's a large disparity of wealth. Here's a list of the original 13 colonies. You can see Georgia down there at the bottom as the last one to show up. Virginia up here at the top is the first. The Carolinas and Maryland. We'll talk about the middle colonies and the New England colonies in another lecture. And here is a chart for all the sort of main things that happened.